The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was a thick, predatory thing, heavier than the grief that was still trying to find its shape inside her chest. Her husband, Elian, had been a man of noise, of booming laughter, of boots clattering on stone, of a sword always being sharpened at the most inconvenient times. Now, the chambers they had shared in the lower levels of the Sky-Tooth Fortress were utterly, terrifyingly still. Wren sat on the edge of their bed, her hands clenched in the rough wool of her skirts. Her useless leg was a dead weight, the familiar ache a dull counterpoint to the sharp new agony in her heart. They had told her he was dead an hour ago. A patrol ambushed on the lower passes. A clean death, they'd said. A warrior's end. It was a lie. Elian had been clumsy but strong, loved by his men. He would not have been taken easily or cleanly. The fortress buzzed with a low hum of activity beyond her door, the sound of a hive disturbed. But inside, there was only the silence and the cold. It was always cold in this fortress, a deep, ancient cold that seeped from the very bones of the mountain. Elian had been her warmth. He had always been chafing her hands, wrapping her in his cloak, complaining about the drafts for her sake. Who would complain for her now? A sound broke the stillness. Not a human sound. It was the soft thump of a heavy body settling against the ground, followed by another and another. A low, guttural sigh, not of aggression, but of contentment. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She pushed herself up, her knuckles white on the carved headboard, and limped the few agonizing steps to the door. The thick oak was cold against her ear. She listened, her breath held tight in her lungs. She could hear them breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic breaths, the sound of a sleeping pack. Wolves. They were right outside her door. Not scratching, not whining, not growling. Just there, sleeping, as if on guard. But that was impossible. The pack wolves of the fortress belonged to the Alpha King. They were his to command, his alone. They did not leave the upper peaks unless he willed it, and certainly did not act as sentries for the widow of a minor captain. The Alpha King hadn't sent them. He didn't even know Elian was dead yet. He likely didn't even know Wren's name. So why were they here? She backed away from the door, her good leg trembling. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. She was alone, a cripple, a widow. And for some reason she could not comprehend, the king's personal pack was camped outside her room. It wasn't a comfort. It felt like an omen. The night passed in a blur of shivering fear and hollow grief. She did not sleep. She watched the embers die, one by one, until the room was plunged into a chilling pre-dawn gray. The wolves remained. She could hear the occasional shift, the soft click of a claw on stone, the huff of a sleeping breath. They were a living wall between her and the rest of the fortress. When the first rays of sun sliced through the arrow-slit window, they brought with them the sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps. Not the shuffling of servants or the tread of guards. This was a sound that made the very stones seem to hold their breath. It was a sound of absolute authority. Wren's heart hammered against her ribs. The footsteps stopped outside her door. The soft sounds of the wolves ceased. There was a new silence now, one of tense, waiting deference. A voice, deep and resonant as a funeral bell, cut through the wood. Open it. It wasn't a request. It was a command that expected the world to reshape itself to his will. She heard the bar on the outside of her door being lifted by a guard. The latch clicked. The door swung inward, revealing a figure that seemed to devour all the light in the corridor. The Alpha King, Theron. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a figure of harsh granite and winter frost on the high battlements. Up close, he was overwhelming. He was impossibly tall, with shoulders that seemed carved from the mountain itself. His black hair was streaked with silver, not the silver of age, but the stark metallic silver of a blade's edge. His eyes. They were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, merciless gray. He stood there, framed by the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room before it landed on her. It was not a kind gaze. It was the gaze of a predator assessing its territory, and she was the strange, broken thing that didn't belong. Behind him, she could see the wolves, huge, gray-furred beasts, rising to their feet with a silent, fluid grace. They were not looking at him. They were looking at her. And in their yellow eyes she saw not hunger, but a strange, unnerving recognition. Theron's gaze dropped to the wolves, then returned to her. A flicker of something, confusion, annoyance, crossed his features. It was there and gone in a second. "You are the widow," he stated. His voice was devoid of warmth, a raw sound of rock and ice. Wren could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She felt small, insignificant, a broken bird in the path of a glacier. He stepped into the room, and the temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He moved with a predator's silence, a terrifying economy of motion. He didn't look at the rumpled bed or the dead fire. He looked only at her, his pale eyes cataloging every detail, her tangled hair, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way she favored her good leg. "Your husband was murdered," he said, "not killed. Murdered." The word was a stone dropped into the well of her grief. "They said, an ambush," she whispered, her voice a reedy thing. "They lied." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at him. She could smell the scent of pine and cold, clean air clinging to his leathers. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, just a single blade in the back, the work of a coward. His words confirmed the cold dread in her gut. Elian hadn't been defeated. He'd been betrayed. The king's gaze was relentless. "Why are my wolves at your door?" The question was sharp, an accusation, as if she had summoned them, as if she, in her powerlessness, could command the beasts that answered only to the alpha of alphas. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking but honest. "I heard them last night. They just came." He stared at her, searching for a lie. She met his gaze, too terrified and grief-stricken to be anything but transparent. For a long moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. She felt stripped bare under his scrutiny, as if he could see every crack in her spirit, every fear she'd ever held. Then, something shifted in the icy depths of his eyes. The hard assessment softened, just a fraction, into something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. The same unnerving recognition she'd seen in his wolves. He took another step closer. "You will be moved to the upper keep, for your protection." "My lord, It is not a request, woman." He cut her off, his voice dropping low, a rumble of thunder that vibrated through the floor. "Your husband was one of my captains. His murder within my fortress is an insult. The insult will be answered. Until it is, you are a liability and a mystery." His eyes flicked to the wolves, who had now crept into the room behind him, their massive bodies flanking him like living statues. They sat, their gazes fixed on Wren. "A mystery," he repeated, more to himself than to her, "that I intend to solve." He turned and strode from the room without another word, leaving her trembling in the sudden vacuum of his presence. The cold he left behind was worse than the mountain's chill. It was the cold of absolute power, of centuries of isolation. 2 guards entered, their faces impassive. "My lady, the king has ordered us to escort you." Wren looked past them, into the corridor. The wolves were rising, not to follow their master, but to follow her. She took a hesitant, painful step forward, and the pack moved with her, a silent gray tide of muscle and fur. She was their prisoner, their charge, their queen. She didn't know which. All she knew was that her quiet, broken life had just been shattered, and the pieces were being claimed by a king whose heart seemed as cold and unforgiving as the stone of his throne. The rooms in the upper keep were opulent, a stark contrast to the soldier's simplicity she had shared with Elian. Silken hangings absorbed the sound, and a massive hearth blazed with a fire that fought back the mountain's chill. It was a gilded cage. Theron had installed her here and then vanished. For 3 days, she saw no one but the silent servants who brought her meals and the guards who stood outside her new, much heavier door. And the wolves. They were always there. Not the whole pack, but 2 or 3 of the largest, who lay sprawled on the cold flagstones of the corridor as if they had been born there. She spent the days staring into the fire, her grief a constant, heavy companion. The mystery of Elian's death and the king's strange behavior were a confusing fog around the sharp edges of her loss. Why this attention? Why her? She was a nobody, the lame wife of a captain, a political marriage to an older man who had shown her the only kindness she'd ever known. On the 4th day, he returned. He entered without knocking, the door swinging open as if by his will alone. He was not dressed in the severe leathers of their first meeting, but in a simple dark tunic that somehow made him seem even larger, more imposing. He carried no weapon, but he didn't need one. He was the weapon. He said nothing, simply walked to the hearth and stared into the flames. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Wren remained seated in a high-backed chair, her hands twisting a loose thread on the armrest. "The council believes your husband was killed by a rival clan from the lowlands," he said finally, his voice flat. He didn't turn to look at her. "They say it was a message." "And what do you say, my lord?" she asked, her voice quiet. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp and cruel in the firelight. "I say my council is full of fools and old men who see the enemies they expect, not the ones who are already inside the walls." A shiver traced its way down her spine, an enemy within the fortress. "They also believe you should be sent back to your family," he continued, his tone still devoid of emotion. "They say your presence here is a complication." Her family? The word was ash in her mouth. Her father, who had sold her to Elian for the price of a border treaty, had not even feigned sadness at her defective leg. He would not welcome a widowed cripple back into his halls. Sending her back was a death sentence of a different kind, a life of mockery and isolation, locked away where no one could see the family's shame. "I see," she whispered, her gaze dropping to her lap. Hope, a fragile thing she hadn't even realized she was holding, began to wither. "Do you?" He turned fully to face her now, his pale eyes pinning her to the chair. "Do you wish to leave?" The question was a test. She knew it. Her throat was dry. "I wish for my husband's murderer to be found." A flicker of approval in those icy eyes. "So do I." He took a step toward her. "The wolves, they do not leave your door, even when I command them. They obey, but they return the moment my attention is elsewhere. They have never defied me. Not in 500 years. 500 years. The number hung in the air, incomprehensible. She was looking at a man who had walked this world for half a millennia. A man who had seen empires rise and fall, whose own life was a saga of blood and stone. And she was a fleeting, broken thing of 22 years. "Why?" he asked, the word raw, torn from him. It was the first time she had heard anything but absolute control in his voice. "What are you to them?" "I am nothing," she said, the words a bitter, familiar truth. "A woman with a bad leg and a dead husband. No." The word was sharp, absolute. He closed the distance between them, looming over her chair. He didn't touch her, but she felt the force of his presence like a physical blow. "There is something in you." Something my wolf recognizes. His voice faltered on the word wolf, a strange hesitation that seemed painful. There is a silence in me, where he used to be, a quiet that has been growing for a century. But when I am near you, it lessens. It's as if I can almost hear him again. Her breath caught. He was speaking of his inner beast, the source of his power, his very soul as an alpha. And it was fading. The most powerful man in the known world was dying inside. He seemed to regret the admission instantly. A mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. But it was too late. She had seen the crack in the glacier. She had seen the flicker of desperation in the ancient king's eyes. He stared at her, his jaw tight. Then, with a sudden jerky movement, he reached out. His fingers, long and cold, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was shockingly light, a ghost of a caress that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was not a lover's touch, not even a kind one. It was a touch of pure, bewildered curiosity, as if he were touching a strange artifact he couldn't understand. And then he was gone, turning on his heel and stalking from the room, leaving her with the phantom sensation of his cold fingers on her skin and the staggering weight of his secret. He was broken too, in a different way, a deeper way, but just as broken as she was. After that, his visits became a strange ritual. He would appear at odd hours, always unannounced. He rarely spoke. Sometimes he would simply stand by the fire, a brooding statue of granite. Other times, he would sit in the chair opposite hers, the great alpha king of the north, and read from a heavy leather-bound book, the words a low murmur in the quiet room. Ren found herself waiting for him. The hours he was not there felt empty, the silence of the room returning to the predatory thing it had been on that first night. His presence, as intimidating as it was, filled the space. It pushed back the grief, giving it less room to breathe. One evening, he arrived looking paler than usual, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow despite the room's chill. He moved stiffly, sinking into the chair with a barely suppressed groan of pain. Ren watched him, her heart giving a strange, painful lurch. He had closed his eyes, his face a mask of agony. "My lord?" she ventured, her voice soft. He didn't open his eyes. "It is nothing." His voice was tight, strained. It wasn't nothing. It was the fading he'd spoken of. It was the silence inside him, and it was hurting him. She could feel it, a resonance of his pain that vibrated in the air between them. Without thinking, she pushed herself out of her chair. She ignored the protest of her own aching leg and limped to the small table where a carafe of spiced wine was always kept warm by the hearth. She poured a cup, her hand surprisingly steady, and brought it to him. She held it out. "Drink this." His eyes snapped open, blazing with a cold fire. "I do not need your pity." "It isn't pity," she said, her voice firm, surprising herself. "It is wine. You are in pain. It might help." He stared at her, at the simple cup offered in her trembling hand. The fury in his eyes warred with something else, something weary and ancient. For a moment she thought he would strike the cup from her hand. Instead, his gaze dropped to the floor. Slowly, as if it cost him a great deal, he reached out and took the cup. His cold fingers brushed hers, and the jolt was stronger this time, a spark of warmth in the desolate cold. He drank the wine in 2 long swallows, his throat working. He handed the empty cup back to her. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, almost inaudible, as if they were foreign to his tongue. She took the cup and returned to her seat. Neither of them spoke of it again, but something had shifted. A fragile bridge had been built across the chasm of silence between them. He was the king, and she was the broken widow. But in that moment, they had been something else. 2 damaged souls in a quiet room, sharing a brief respite from their private pain. Lord Valerius, Elian's former commander and closest friend, was the only other person permitted to visit her. He was a handsome man, with warm eyes and a gentle smile that had always seemed out of place in the harsh fortress. He brought her news from the lower keep and stories of Elian that made her both laugh and cry. He was a comforting link to the life that had been stolen from her. "The king keeps you close," Valerius noted one afternoon, his gaze flicking toward the guards at the door. "The court whispers. They say he means to make you his concubine." Wren flinched, color rising in her cheeks. "He does not. He is investigating." Valerius's smile was kind, but his eyes were sharp. "Of course. But you must be careful, Wren. The king is not a man. He is a force of nature. And his attention can be as deadly as his indifference. People are afraid. They see the wolves at your door. They see the favor of the king. And they invent reasons. They call you a witch." His words were a cold stone in her stomach. "A witch?" "They say you ensnared the wolves," he said, his voice dropping. "They say you enchanted the king to gain power. They whisper that you had a hand in Elian's death to clear your path to the throne." The accusation was so vile, so monstrous that it stole her breath. She stared at him, horrified. "I know it isn't true," he said quickly, placing a comforting hand on her arm. His touch was warm, solid. "But fear makes people cruel. I am telling you this as a friend. Be wary. Trust no one, not even the king." His warning lingered long after he had gone, a poisonous seed planted in the fragile soil of her trust. She watched Theron during his next visit, searching his stoic face for signs of the dangerous obsession Valerius had hinted at. But all she saw was the deep, weary loneliness and the carefully hidden pain. His episodes grew more frequent. The cold fits, as she began to call them in her mind, would leave him rigid with agony, his skin taking on a deathly bluish pallor. He never spoke of them, but he stopped trying to hide them from her entirely. He would simply come to her chambers, sink into his chair, and ride out the wave of pain in her quiet presence. She, in turn, learned to tend to him. She would build up the fire, bring him the warm spiced wine, and sometimes she would talk. She told him about her childhood, about her love of books, about the way Elian used to hum off key when he thought no one was listening. She spoke of small, simple things, weaving a tapestry of words to distract him from the great, silent beast that was devouring him from within. He was a rapt audience. He would watch her, his pale eyes intense, as if her simple stories were the most profound tales he had ever heard. One night, the fit was worse than any before. He collapsed as he came through the door, his massive frame hitting the stone floor with a sickening thud. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She rushed to his side, her own leg screaming in protest. He was convulsing, his body rigid, his teeth clenched. A layer of frost was actually forming on his tunic. He was burning from the inside out with a deathly cold. "Theron!" she cried, using his name for the first time. She grabbed the heaviest fur from her bed and dragged it over him, her movements clumsy and desperate. She knelt beside him, helpless. His fading was killing him, right here, on her floor. Instinct took over. She placed her hands on his chest, right over his heart, trying to chafe some warmth back into him, the way Elian used to do for her. "Don't," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Please don't." His skin was like ice, but beneath her palms she felt something else. A flicker. A faint, deep thrum that seemed to answer the touch of her hands. It was impossibly distant. A single drumbeat in a vast, silent chasm. The convulsion eased. The frost on his clothes began to recede. He let out a long, shuddering breath, and his eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they focused on her hands still pressed to his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In that moment, she understood. Her presence, her touch, was not just a comfort. It was an anchor. It was a lifeline to the dying wolf inside him. She was the only thing keeping him from fading completely. The revelation was terrifying. It bound her to him with chains heavier than any royal decree. Her life was no longer her own. It was tied to the survival of the ancient broken king who was, impossibly, becoming the center of her world. The whispers in the court grew louder, turning from fearful speculation to open accusation. Valerius brought her the news, his face grim. A faction on the council, led by a stern traditionalist lord named Kale, was demanding her expulsion. Kale says you are a cancer in the heart of the fortress, Valerius told her, his voice low and urgent. He claims you have weakened the king, made him a slave to your sorcery. He is using the king's illness as proof. It's not sorcery, Wren said, her hands clenched. He's just unwell. They do not see it that way, Valerius insisted. They see a king who has forsaken his duties to sit by your fire. They see a pack that defies its master to sleep at your door. They are planning to act, Wren. They mean to present an ultimatum to the king. You, or their loyalty. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, wrapped itself around her heart. She was the cause of a rift that could tear the kingdom apart. Her presence was not healing Theron. It was destroying his reign. That evening, Theron did not come. The silence in her chambers was absolute, a crushing weight. The wolves at her door were restless, whining softly, their anxiety a mirror of her own. For the first time, she felt utterly, completely alone again. The fragile world she had built within these four walls was about to be torn down. Late in the night, there was a soft scratch at her door. It wasn't the sound of a guard or a servant. Wren? It was Valerius's voice, a hushed whisper. She unbarred the door. He slipped inside, his face pale in the moonlight. I shouldn't be here, he said breathlessly. Kale has convinced the council. They are moving against you. They mean to arrest you at dawn, to stand trial for witchcraft. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. Trial. That meant a pyre. Theron. The king, she stammered. Ichi is trapped, Valerius said, his eyes filled with what looked like pity. He is weak. Kale has the loyalty of the fortress guard. If the king defends you, it will be civil war. He cannot win. Not in his current state. He took her hands, his grip firm. There is only one way. You must flee. I have arranged it. A secret passage, a horse waiting. You can be gone before dawn. It will save you, and it will save him from having to make an impossible choice. Run. The idea was both terrifying and a sweet, desperate relief. To escape the whispers, the fear, the crushing weight of the king's life in her hands. But to leave Theron? To abandon him to the silence, to the cold fits, to the men who were circling him like vultures? I can't, she whispered. I can't leave him. You must. Valerius's voice was sharp with urgency. Your staying here is what is killing him. It is your presence that Kale uses as a weapon against him. If you are gone, their argument vanishes. He will have time to recover, to consolidate his power. It is the only way to save him, Wren. You have to go. His logic was a cruel, twisting knife. He was right. Her presence was the source of the conflict. To save the man she was, coming to care for, she had to abandon him. Tears streamed down her face. Where would I go? South, he said, his voice softening. I have family there. They will take you in. You will be safe. He squeezed her hands. It is time. We must go now. He led her to a tapestry on the far wall, one depicting an ancient battle. He pulled at a loose thread, and a section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The cold air that wafted out smelled of damp earth and secrets. She looked back at the room, at the chair where Theron always sat. Leaving felt like a betrayal. It felt like dying. For him, Valerius whispered, his hand on her back, gently urging her forward. For him. She took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, leaving the fire, the wolves, and the sleeping king behind. The passage was narrow and steep, winding down into the guts of the mountain. Valerius held a small glowstone, its pale light doing little to ward off the oppressive dark. Every step was an agony for Wren's leg, but she pushed on, fueled by a desperate fear. They emerged into a small subterranean stable where a single horse stood saddled and waiting. The air was thick with the smell of hay and manure. "Here," Valerius said, moving to help her mount. But something was wrong. The horse was calm, too calm, and the passage behind them, it hadn't closed. A faint draft whispered through the opening. "Valerius," she said, her voice trembling. "Who killed Elian?" He froze, his hand on the saddle. He turned to her slowly. The warm, kind smile was gone. In the faint light of the glowstone, his face was a stranger's mask, cold and calculating. "He was a means to an end," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all its previous warmth. "He was loyal, and I needed his position, but his loyalty was to the king, not to the future." The truth hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Not Kale, not a rival clan. It was him, the friend, the comforter. "You," she breathed, the word laced with horror and disbelief. "It was you all along." "Kyle is a fool, a useful one," Valerius sneered. "He spouts tradition while I make plans. The king is fading. Everyone can see it. The pack is leaderless, the throne is vulnerable. I mean to take it. But the wolves, their obsession with you, the king's attachment. You became an unforeseen complication." He took a step toward her, his eyes glinting. "I had hoped you would run. It would have been cleaner. But this works as well. The witch, slain while trying to escape. It will only cement Kale's belief and turn the last of the king's loyalists against him. By sunrise, the throne will be mine." He drew a dagger from his belt, its edge gleaming in the dim light. This was it. Her death. Not a pyre, but a cold blade in a dark, forgotten corner of the fortress. She backed away, her bad leg scraping against the stone. There was nowhere to go. She was trapped. She thought of Theron, alone in his chambers, weak, believing she had abandoned him. The thought was more painful than the fear of the blade. "You won't get away with this," she spat, her voice shaking with a rage that burned through her fear. "I already have," he said, lunging. Suddenly a roar echoed from the passage behind them, a sound of pure, primal fury that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was not the sound of a wolf. It was the sound of the Alpha. Theron exploded from the darkness. He was not the pale, pained man from her chambers. He was a terrifying spectacle of royal rage. His eyes were not gray. They were blazing silver, glowing with an inner light. His body, no longer racked with cold, seemed to thrum with a barely contained power. The air around him crackled. Valerius stumbled back, his face a mask of shocked terror. "How? You thought I was weak," Theron growled, his voice a guttural thunder. "You thought I was blind." He took a step forward, and Valerius scrambled backward. The moment she was gone from my side, the silence came back. It was a storm. It would have killed me. But it also woke me. I felt her fear. His silver gaze found Wren, and for a heartbeat the rage softened into a desperate relief. "You are safe." "My king," Valerius stammered, raising his hands. "She is a witch. She tried to flee. I caught her." "Liar," Theron snarled. He looked at Wren. "Tell me." "He killed Elian," she said, her voice clear and strong. He planned all of it. He wanted the throne. Theron's gaze snapped back to Valerius. The temperature in the stable plummeted. "For your treason," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Death is too kind a gift." But Valerius was a cornered rat. With a desperate yell, he didn't attack the king. He lunged at Ren, grabbing her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, the point of his dagger pressed against her throat. "Stay back!" he shrieked, his composure shattered. "One step and she dies." Theron froze. The incandescent rage in his eyes turned to sheer, stark terror. He was the Alpha King, a demigod of power, and he was rendered helpless by a single blade held against the throat of a crippled woman. "Let her go, Valerius," he said, his voice strained. "I will give you anything." "I want the throne!" Valerius screamed, his spittle hitting Ren's cheek. "And I want her dead. She is the source of your strength. I can feel it." Ren could feel the sharp point of the blade break her skin. A thin trickle of blood ran down her neck. She looked at Theron, at the agony on his face. He was trapped. To save her, he would have to surrender his kingdom to a murderer. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She could not be his weakness. She would not be the price of his downfall. "I love you," she whispered. The words meant only for him, a desperate confession across the space between them. It was a truth she hadn't even admitted to herself until now, and it was the last thing she would ever say. With all her strength, she threw her weight backward, ramming her head into Valerius's face. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She shoved herself away from him, not toward Theron, not toward safety, but directly into the path of the panicked, rearing horse. She saw Theron's face contort in a silent scream of her name. She saw the flash of a shod hoof. Then, nothing. Pain. Fire. A wave of force slamming into her, but it wasn't the impact of the horse. It was coming from inside her. A light erupted from her chest, a blinding torrent of pure golden energy. It was the warmth of 1,000 suns, the life force of a primal forest. It threw the horse back, sent Valerius flying into the far wall, and slammed into Theron like a physical caress. Ren stood, her body trembling, bathed in the golden light that poured from her. Her leg, the ache was gone, the weakness was gone. She felt whole. She felt powerful. The energy pouring from her was not her own, not entirely. It was a circuit. It flowed from her, into Theron, and from him, magnified and strengthened, back into her. The bond. It wasn't just an anchor, it was an amplifier. She was the spark, and he was the fire, and together, they were an inferno. She looked at Theron. He was on one knee, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of the power flooding into him. The silver glow in his eyes was now shot through with gold. The silence inside him was gone, replaced by the roaring, triumphant song of his fully awakened wolf, a song she could now hear in her own soul. He rose to his feet, no longer a fading king, but a god reborn. He looked at her, his face filled with an awe and a love so profound it stole her breath. Valerius groaned from the corner where he'd been thrown, trying to push himself up. Theron didn't even glance at him. He raised a hand, and the shadows in the corners of the stable seemed to coalesce, to reach for the traitor. Valerius screamed as they enveloped him, a chilling, final sound that was quickly silenced. Then, there was only the two of them, standing in the fading golden light. Theron crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch no longer cold, but radiating a fierce, living warmth. He searched her eyes, his own filled with 1,000 emotions, gratitude, love, terror at what he had almost lost. "Ren," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion, "you are my mate." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable truth that settled into the very marrow of her bones. She was his. He was hers. They were two halves of a single soul, broken apart and finally, impossibly, made whole. "I know," she whispered, her own tears finally falling, not of grief or fear, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt like she might burst. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of gentle curiosity, but a kiss of desperate, soul-deep claiming. It was the taste of pine and winter and a love that had waited 500 years to be born. It was the feeling of coming home. 6 months later, Queen Wren stood on the high battlements of the Sky-Tooth Fortress, a heavy fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The wind was sharp and cold, but she no longer felt it. A constant, steady warmth hummed beneath her skin, a warmth that had its source in the man who stood beside her. Theron's arm was a solid, reassuring weight around her waist. He had changed. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the icy bleakness in his eyes replaced by a warm, silver light. His reign, once defined by fear and cold authority, was now one of strength and vitality. He was no longer a fading king, he was the High King, his power absolute, his wolf a living, breathing presence that the entire kingdom could feel. Wren's leg was still not perfect. It ached when the weather turned, and she still walked with a slight limp. But it was no longer a mark of her worthlessness. Theron had called it her anchor to the mortal world, the thing that reminded him of the fragility he had sworn to protect. It was a part of her story, a part of the woman his soul had recognized. The pack wolves now followed her everywhere, a constant, silent honor guard. They were her companions, her friends, her family. She was their queen as much as she was his. Below them, the fortress bustled with life. The cloud of fear and suspicion that had hung over it had been dispelled, replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty to the king and his miraculous queen. The story of her power, of their bond, had become a legend whispered around every hearth fire. Theron turned her to face him, his hands cupping her cheeks. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "I was thinking about the silence," she said softly. "The one from that first night. How loud it was." He nodded, his expression somber. "I lived in that silence for a century. I thought it was my tomb." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. She could feel the deep, steady thrum of his life force, the powerful song of his wolf, the overwhelming force of his love. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "And now?" he whispered. Wren smiled, her hand coming up to rest over his heart. "Now," she said, "there is only music."